Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Nona from thealignedlover.com. I watched Nosferatu the other day and I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I decided to do this Jungian inspired film analysis and approach it like it is a dream. This is going to be quite a long video, but I'll try to summarize what I wrote in a blog post that you can find in the description box. I go into film symbolism, the Jungian figures or archetypes, character analysis, and most importantly, animus development and some brief astrological insights. But I highly recommend looking at my blog post if you want a ton of detail, because I go through the movie and I really analyze what's happening. I discuss the symbols, so don't read it if you haven't watched the movie and you don't want spoilers. Also, please note that I believe in art being interpreted in many ways, so this is just my interpretation. And note, I am not a Jungian analyst or expert, so this is going to reflect my current understanding of all that material. Alright, we have a lot of symbols in this movie. It's very visually rich, and the story just has so much symbolism to it. A note about symbolisms and symbols: even though they're very universal, they also require a lot of context when interpreting them. So, for example, a car in my dream would represent a vehicle, but if someone from, say, the 1600s were to dream of a vehicle, they would dream of probably like a horse and carriage, because cars didn't exist yet. So there needs to be a little bit of context. So if they dreamed of a car, that would mean something unknown or alien. So I mention this because the definitions I choose, or I've chosen, are the ones that I find the most appropriate and the most aligned with the context of the film. So keep that in mind. There's many ways to interpret symbols, but I tried my best to include the definitions that are the most relevant. Now, we also have a lot of Jungian figures or archetypes. Do research that yourself if you want to get into it. These are very short definitions that lack a lot of nuance, but I wanted to include a list because I do mention these a lot, namely the shadow, the aspects we choose to reject and suppress as individuals and as the collective, the animus, which is a woman's accumulated perception of masculinity, initially modeled by the father figure. If you want to substitute the term masculinity for like a competitive, directed will, planned action, differentiating, judging, intellectual kind of mode, that's what it is. I know masculinity and femininity as terms can seem a little outdated, and they have this kind of buzzword, archaic feel to them. So that's what I mean by masculinity. And we're looking at Ellen's animus because she has a lot of what is very feminine. She has a lot of that Eros energy. We can also look at masculinity as logos and femininity as Eros, which I do get into when I analyze Friedrich and Anna. Now, animus development is kind of vital to my analysis of at least Ellen. In animus development, if you take a step back, it is how someone refines the way that they channel their life force, which is essentially their libido or their sexual energy. Sexual energy is life force. Stage 1, life force, sexuality is equated to animalistic instincts, raw power, strength. If you relate to man on this level, then man is there to protect you and give you pleasure, kind of like a caveman. Stage 2, man is beginning to direct his life force into planned actions and start fulfilling duties that are usually assigned by society. You can relate to man as a father or husband. Stage 3, that will is being refined further. You're finding creative outlets, higher callings, higher learning, and the men who kind of represent this stage of development are like clergymen, professors, or priests. At this stage, man is no longer just like a husband or a provider. Man is someone who you can engage with on a more intellectual or creative level. And then finally, man as a spiritual guide that helps bridge the conscious and unconscious. Basically, at this stage, sexuality or life force takes on a spiritual level. And of course, our characters, we have Count Orlok, who is obviously the shadow and the primitive Animus. I argue that. Ellen, the self, our main character, who is facing shadow integration and Animus possession, and Thomas, who is both the positive Animus and also someone who is interacting and having to face Count Orlok. And remember that, like in a dream, roles are not strict or definite. They can change and intermingle. The roles are not completely set. They're always like in a fluid state. We have von Franz, who's the trickster in a good way in the stage. Friedrich, who is a man who represents Logos, and Hernock, who is the negative trickster, the very negative level of falling into the shadow. All right, so let's get into the meat of my analysis, which is basically looking at how Ellen develops her relationship to the Animus and the shadow, and where does it start? Well, it starts with her lonely childhood because she suffered from being very shamed by her father. Her father got really creeped out by her psychic gifts. She predicted her mother's death. That really freaked him out. He recoiled at her touch. He also happened to witness her naked pleasuring herself, so he also shamed her for her sexuality and threatened to send her away to what I assume to be a mental hospital, which is horrendous. So all of that basically means that she had no outlet for her psychic faculty and her strong life force and libido. She had nowhere to direct it, nowhere to channel it, and she was also shamed and very lonely, so that all gets repressed and she has to call out for anyone to basically value her and recognize her. And she ends up summoning the very shadowy Count Orlok, who is someone who not only recognizes but celebrates how strong she is in her psychic powers and her sensuality. That's what he needs from her. So the very traits that her father rejected are the traits that he must absolutely consume. He's addicted to them. And again, because she has nowhere to direct her will, her energies, she delegates that to this shadowy figure who can be strong and can take action and can command, because she can't. And it's such a shame because later on in the movie we see two societies where they kind of orbit around a sensual, spiritual figure. First, with the townspeople who follow a naked virgin as they hunt vampires, and second, with the Orthodox nuns who are, again, nuns. They're feminine and they channel their spiritual power, and they live in this beautiful, golden, lush, rich church. So it isn't that she has absolutely no choice and cannot at all channel her energy. It's because she lives in a society that, does not give her the means to do so. So she tries to distance herself from this beast that she has pledged to by marrying Thomas, and it's a little bit happy for a while. She can take on a more positive outlet for her libido and her life force with her new husband, but when he has to leave in attempts to elevate their material status, she is forced into independence. She is forced to be by herself again, and because she again has no outlet for all of this energy, it leaks out of her as seizures and sleepwalking. So again, looking at Animus development, Thomas leaving her is showing that he's a man of planned action, he is directing his will, and he's also, in a way, encouraging her to be more independent because they're not together. But she doesn't really know how to be alone. So she keeps having seizures, and the somnambulism keeps occurring until finally she meets von Franz, the first man who can recognize her traits and her power without needing to relate to her as a lover. So he represents the third level of Animus development, where she makes contact with a man of higher learning and they can relate to each other beyond just societal roles, beyond just shared sexuality. And von Franz even acts as a liminal figure. He guides her towards her final stage, which is where she takes on the final sexual act that is infused with spirituality, because it ends up defeating her shadow, or at least allowing her to integrate the shadow. So we see the whole story from having to repress herself and needing such a strong, domineering Animus figure, to relating to Thomas, to relating to von Franz as a man of higher learning, to being guided so that she can infuse her sexuality and direct her life force towards spirituality. So now let's look at Orlok as this very strong Animus shadow figure. It's like the Animus has allied with the shadow to be extremely strong. And I included these quotes from Jung because they're very relevant here, so feel free to read those. But essentially, when an animus is so prevalent, it directs the woman's consciousness. It creates these structures, these rules, and she can't really be, convinced otherwise. Ellen is convinced that Orlok is coming and that he's going to come get her and that only he can see her. That animus grip has created this kind of prison for her, and only she can really get herself out of it. Her husband can't do it, the priest can't do it, the professor can't do it. It's only the self who can face the personal shadow. No one else can do it. All right, now let's talk about Thomas as both a positive animus figure and as an individual figure who is also facing Orlok, because he is also facing his shadow. Orlok is Ellen's shadow mostly, but shadows are never completely personal. There's always something collective going on, and maybe they represent different things because, a multifaceted surface, they reflect different traits back to the viewer or the self. So in the beginning of the story, we see that Thomas dismisses Ellen's premonition. He is rejecting the superstitious experience. He doesn't believe in the supernatural, even though when he goes to Herr Knox, he is greeted by strange, menacing, devilish laughter and sees these occult signals. He kind of brushes this off and says it doesn't exist. Even when he gets to the townsfolk's place and he is given a cross, he doesn't believe. When he sees the vampire exhumation, he doesn't believe. And when he gets to the crossroads with the driverless carriage, he still doesn't really believe. not until he descends into the crypt and faces the shadow and the unconscious does he finally accept that the supernatural exists. So he's no longer someone who only believes in the rational, he's being initiated into this new realm. Now Thomas is attacked by Orlok and half dead. He is chased out of a window, and to escape he has to jump into a river, with the river flowing water being a symbol of the unconscious, the intuition and forward progression in life. He is saved by Orthodox nuns, and this acts kind of like a baptism where the past sins, aka Orlok's like plague bite, is somehow healed, and he's also initiated into mysticism. And the nuns ask him to stay there where he can be safe, but he remembers that, he needs to go save Ellen and the town, so he leaves his safety to make progress. So he is developing, it's kind of like the hero's journey where he goes on a quest and kind of fights the dragon and gains some sacred knowledge, but it's not directly like that, and it's not exactly his story. But I will note that the only reason Thomas has been this tormented is because he allowed the shadow to overwhelm him. He allowed Orlok to trick him or deceive him into signing these papers. He allowed him to lock him in the castle, and that's because the shadow is attacking his weakness. And I will say the sad part about Thomas and Ellen's story is that in the scene where Ellen has a fight with Thomas and really lashes out at him and attacks his weaknesses in a fit of Animus possession, she compares him to Orlok as lovers, and that is the only time in the movie where he initiates with her. So he exercises his libido not to connect with Ellen, but to compete with Orlok and to compete with the shadow. So it's not like he really, really ever recognizes Ellen and sees her for who she is and her values and her power. He accepts her, he loves her, but he still doesn't get it, and that's what she wants. She wants to be seen and recognized, and he just can't do it. Alright, so let's look at Mr. Friedrich, who represents cold rationalism, and his way of existence and thinking is exactly what allows Orlok's plague to thrive, because he just keeps denying the irrational and the supernatural. So he thrives in a Victorian community as a ship merchant. Basically, he makes all of his money shipping things across the ocean above the unconscious and never really delving into it. He doesn't really respect Ellen and everything she stands for because she doesn't behave in a way that's like his perfect wife. Ellen disrupts his idyllic perfect family life, and he resolves to just restraining her, tying her up, essentially just repressing her and acting much like her father, who shamed her and repressed her. So he is much like that initial force that caused her to seek out that shadow in the first place. Ironically, when the plague ships arrive, he is the first one alerted, and that's because when the shadow starts spilling over, it's usually the cold rationalist who feel its presence first, because it's so jarring and unfamiliar to them. Eventually, his family dies, and in his final moments, he returns to his wife and makes love to a corpse, which is another symbol of his total commitment to the material. He's just all about the material, the earth, what can be felt, seen, and proven, and he never really accepts the other aspect. Alright, so finally we get to the ending, and that marriage, that union of the unconscious and consciousness is essentially what allows the shadow to be integrated, and it must be faced. It can't be defeated. It has to be faced, and only in the purifying light of consciousness can it lose its power. Only when you look at it, contemplate it, begin to understand it, and stop hiding from it or repressing it, can the shadow really be neutralized, because it's never destroyed, it's only integrated and neutralized, and she has to die in order for true transformation to occur. You can read it as her old self dying, you can read it as her truly dying, you can read it as many things, but it's a symbol for transformation. So finally, what lurks in the shadows comes to light, and at the end, Ellen can finally channel her life force. She can finally direct it. She feels that sense of agency that was so foreign to her, and it's just such a tragedy that an ocean or a boat ride away, a horseback journey away, she could have lived in a society where she was valued and recognized and encouraged, and she had meaningful work, but she didn't, and she lived in a very rational society, which is where the plague was allowed to fester, because the townspeople were not equipped to really understand the shadow and the forces of Orlok. They couldn't contend with it. They had no defense, and they could not coexist with it, with him, the way that the nuns and the townspeople could. And finally, just really brief astrological insights. These were the 2 cast members who had like a confirmed birth time. So with Lily Rose, tons of Scorpio moon and rising. She's got Virgo MC, which is about like purification. Her sun is in her 8th house, opposite Pluto, and her chart ruler Mars is in the 12th house. The 12th house of like liberation, imprisonment, and rebirth. So a lot of death, rebirth, purification themes in her chart, and she really channels that. In the past, she played a wildcat, or a woman who is overly identified with her primitive animal side in the wolf. And she also plays Jocelyn, who dates a very dangerous cult leader in The Idol. And then we have Willem Dafoe, Moon in Virgo in the 9th house, like purifying professor vibes, Capricorn ascendant with the chart ruler Saturn in Scorpio, along with the MC, and an 8th house stellium. So death, purification, and knowledge and rebirth are also themes in his chart. He actually played Orlok in Shadow of the Vampire. He plays a lot of trickster roles like the Green Goblin, Ryuk in Death Note, Paul Smecker in the Boondock Saints, which I was like so obsessed with. And he also played Jesus. He is chaos. He cannot be contained. Alright, that was it. Please check out my blog post where I go into a lot more detail, but I don't know, this movie made me think so much. And sorry if my audio is off because I had to use my computer audio. My mic's not working. Anyways, tell me what you think about the movie. I love reading people's interpretations, and any cool like Jungian resources online. I love Marie von Franz. I have like 3 of her books. She's amazing. So yeah,